Voting, being at the very center of Nigeria's election cycle, is the reason why low turnout can be a worrying decimal for democracy to be evaluated as an accurate reflection of a majority. That's our focus on Special Report.
We begin with the imperatives of having an independent electoral body, as well as regular electoral reform. Part of the conversations had by former President Goodluck Jonathan and the former chairman of the Independent National Electoral Commission, who were among the dignitaries who attended the Reflection Conference on Democratic Elections in West Africa.
But also
Issues around election administration, technology deployment, and others form the crux of the discussions.
from the lenses of the elections that have held in 2023 and 2024, you would agree with us that last year was a super year of elections across the world. But it appears this year might even be a super year of elections. And so we've convened this conference to reflect on what are the key lessons from the last elections that we've observed. And we are so delighted that we have individuals and organizations that played active roles in those elections to share some of their lessons and also some of the challenges as we plan towards the elections to be held in 2025.
For the former president, Dr. Goodluck Jonathan, he underscored the importance of reform.
Electoral laws and processes like Jiga mentioned should be regularly reviewed and updated to address emerging challenges and incorporate best practices. For instance, in Nigeria, for the review of the electoral laws to be meaningful, it must be comprehensive enough in order to address all the gray areas that plague the conduct of elections at both the national and state level. The issue of controversy about Beaver and IREF, for example. If the Beaver capture a data, that data should be automatically uploaded in the IREF. It should not depend on an interface by a human factor who will now come and tell us about glitches. Because it is so automated that no human factor will stop it, then of course it will be seamless. But if I am to direct the Beaver before the Beaver was supposed to do the work that has been automated, then I can do what I think it suits my interest. So yes, technology, like I said before, deployment of technology alone has not solved the problem, but we must not go away from technology because the world is just to improve what you have to the point that it will no longer be a problem, but technologies will enhance the credibility of our electoral processes. And one of the things, foster political tolerance, one of the things we know in Nigeria and some African countries that we go is that towards the election you can see the tension. The political tolerance, the intolerance is so much. And people raise all kinds of issues. Even Ghana, that the election turned out to be good. We know when we went there for the pre-election visit, even the party that won the election, Mahama's party, the complaints fill so many cartons. They never believed, they attacked the Electoral Commission, the tax security, and so on. We have to speak to these people, have very serious meetings with them, and so on. But during the election result came out clearly. All those areas of fear were not there. If for Nigeria and some few West African countries, what I would describe, my Professor Jiga will have a better name as a professor, I feel that our electoral processes are too regionalized. The interests of regions, and where the interests of regions overwhelm the national interests, the electoral processes will always be muddled because of regional interests. Sometimes if I listen to the prediction by soothsayers and religious men and women of God and so on, even their predictions tend to go towards their regional interests. So when the electoral process is so regionalized, we always have issues.
While Professor Atahiru Jega highlighted the challenges facing democracy.
The model of democracy in West African countries is the type called liberal democracy or representative democracy or electoral democracy. It is the type practiced in countries which colonized the sub-region, notably France and Britain, and which was inherited and or imposed at independence, and efforts made by post-colonial elites at democratic consolidation. It is a model predicated on certain fundamental principles such as citizens' participation in the election of their representatives in governance, as direct participation when democracy evolved is deemed no longer feasible, in multi-party competitive elections, and in a political system predicated upon freedom to choose, freedom of association, freedom of speech, and accommodation of diversity. This model has since the 18th century become the most widespread, popular, and resilient way of organizing politics and governance in modern nation states, to such an extent that by the 20th century, Winston Churchill referred to it as the worst system of government except for all the others. And in the 21st century, Larry Diamond, a notable scholar of democratization, asserted that it was the only game in town. Given its prevalence, if not dominance, as the preferred organizing framework of politics and governance in modern nation states. The evolution and history of democracy in West Africa, as indeed in the whole of Africa, however, have not been wholly or even relatively satisfactory with regards to all its underlying principles and expectations. Multi-party politics, circumscribed by negative identity mobilization, has been fractious, conflict-ridden, often violent and divisive, rather than accommodative or unifying diversity. Elected representatives of the people, in general, have failed to represent the people and their general interest, and have rather advanced their particularistic, often individualistic and parochial interests, operating literally and democratically. Indeed, elected representatives in governance have constrained, obstructed, and undermined virtually all freedoms associated with the liberal or representative democracy. Elections became largely farcical rituals designed to ensure retention of the incumbent president and party in power. And the barrel of the gun became a common means of effecting changes in government in countries in the region. And even worse, while governance in a democratic context is supposed to satisfy the basic needs and the expectations of citizens through patrimonialism, prebendalism, and kleptocracy, so-called elected representatives of the people have essentially converted public resources into personal fortunes at the expense of citizens' needs and aspirations. As a consequence of all this, by the end of the first decade of independence, virtually all the liberal electoral democracies in West Africa had collapsed and been replaced by either one-party authoritarian or military regimes, all, of course, purporting to address the failures of electoral democracy, to unify their countries, and to satisfy the developmental and socio-economic needs of their citizens and their countries.
The former INEC chairman also outlined steps to be taken to protect democracy.
One, support for democracy, multi-party elections, the rule of law, and accountability is relatively constant and has even increased in the West African sub-region from these reports and surveys of citizens' opinions. So it's amazing that in spite of all these challenges, when citizens are asked from country to country in the West African sub-region, they still believe that democracy is a panacea, and that electoral democracy in particular is an opportunity for citizens to express themselves and to choose their representatives. In spite of the fact that elected officials and so-called representatives have consistently disappointed citizens in terms of addressing their fundamental needs and aspirations. Two, following the broad acceptance as broad acceptance as the sole legitimate mechanism through which political power may be acquired, elections have become the principal focus of domestic political competition, not only in the region but in Africa in general. So there is also belief that if elections are conducted right, they provide a legitimate platform of getting people into positions of power. Thirdly, many, if not all, election management bodies, which are the primary institutions responsible for elections and have broad mandates to deliver polls in line with national legal frameworks, are striving hard, in spite of all the challenges, to organize and conduct elections with integrity. So I conclude by saying, in spite of the worrisome evidence of backsliding of democratic progress in the West African region, yet there remains substantial appetite among citizens for representative and accountable democratic governance. Therefore, electing good representatives in governance and holding them to account would make government more responsible and responsive to the needs and aspirations of citizens for societal progress and socio-economic development. In this regard, citizens, credible civil society organizations, and democratically inclined political actors, what I call drivers of change, should continue to mobilize effectively for credible and sustainable electoral democratic processes in our country or in our sub-region. There has been noticeable progress in the establishment and strengthening of relatively independent election management bodies. They face a lot of challenges, but they need to be strengthened and enabled to be professional in their work and to ensure that they conduct elections with integrity. And the more of them that do this, the better the chances of democratic consolidation, the better the chances of halting democratic reversal, and the better the chances of electoral democracy providing the desired dividends in terms of addressing the needs and aspirations of citizens in these countries.
And now joining us on special report is the Director, Voter Education, INEC, Mrs. Victoria Etamesi. Thank you so much for joining us on the program today.
Thank you for having me. Good afternoon.
Very good afternoon to you. Now, how would you describe voter turnout rates and how they've evolved across recent election cycles in Nigeria?
Yeah, we do not have a clear linear line to describe the growth of voter participation. What we have is an undulating line where you have the voter turnout going up, coming down, going up, coming down. So let's look at some of the statistics. So if you look at 2011 general election, we had a 53% turnout of voters. And for the 2015 general election, we had 68.8 million voters, which translated into 43% of voter turnout. And then we go on to the 2019 general election, we have 84 million voters that turned out, translating into 35.6%. And then now coming to the 2023 general election, we had 93 million registered voters. But we now recorded an abysmal percentage of 27% voter turnout for the elections. It's a bit difficult to put a hold on the reason why the numbers and the figures are undulating, going up and down. But a few factors have been thrown here and there. The issue of transactional voting, but then even that has also thrown up a paradox, because if you have induced voters, then we should have increased voter turnout, but that hasn't been the case, because voters are bought. There's a prevalence of vote buying, yet the numbers are decreasing. So it's an issue that researchers are still trying to grapple with and to come up with why this is so, where it's either it should be going down or it's coming up, or it's going up and down. But for 2027, ideally, again, like I said, when you have increased number of voters, we had 93 million registered voters for 2023 general elections. We would have expected that the increased number of voters would translate into increased number of registered voters would translate into increased number of voters. But unfortunately, that was not the case.
Now, you reference researchers. Now, let's take a look at that for a second. According to recent reports, understanding declining voter turnout in the country, issues such as insecurity may play certain roles. Logistics and psychological barriers have impacted voter participation. Will that be correct in your view?
Yeah, to some extent. Security is a huge factor. Security is a huge factor because that has impeded many people from turning up to vote. So you've registered, but then on election day, because of the do or die mantra, winner takes all. And so the political class is ready to do whatever, to deploy whatever tool that they can to ensure that they maximize the votes that come to them. And so those who are not sure of what awaits them at the polling unit would naturally stay away or keep off the polling unit, even though we make concerted effort to bring them out. But I think there is still a lot for us to do in that regard. Again, looking at the issue of logistics, yes, it's also a teething problem, which we're improving upon, but there's still a lot of work to be done. Sometimes it's not the fault of the election management body, that is INEC, because, for instance, mobilizing men and materials to the polling unit is not totally in the hands of the commission. We rely on vendors. And so when the vendors disappoint us, there is really little or nothing that we can do. We do not have the vehicles to use to deploy men and materials to the polling unit. And so even though we have signed memorandum of understanding with them, we're still in discussions and still trying to fine tune and to see how best we can achieve the most to be efficient, to ensure that men and materials get to the polling unit before 8 o'clock so that voting can commence.
Now,
and then the third one, you talk about the psychological barrier. Yes.
Okay.
I think the citizenry is still, again, there is a disconnect between votes translating into dividends of governance. And so there's some form of disillusionment. So when voters find themselves in that situation, they really couldn't care less whether they should come out or not to vote.
Now let's take another box, shall we? Let's just take it.
Yeah.
There have also been questions as to the thorough cleanup of the voter register, which is the largest database of registered voters in Africa, and whether this revalidation should be for voters who registered since 2011. Now, does INEC plan to carry out any periodic validation? Because this also reduces the cost of elections where millions of ballot papers go to waste.
Yeah, so during the review of the 2023 general elections, 142 recommendations were thrown up, and some of these recommendations revolved around having a more efficient voter register. And with regard to having a clean and a clean voters register, one of the issues that was brought up was the collaboration with the National Identity Management Commission, NIMC, and National Population Commission in order to identify and harvest the names of deceased persons in the register, because there is that issue that quite a number of people in the register of dead persons are still in the register and have not been taken out. One other way that dead persons can be taken out is during the claims and objections period. The Commission is currently planning to resume its continuous voter registration. And during that period, there are periodical seasons when there'll be a break where claims and objections will be made. And in those for objections, persons can come up and identify and object to the inclusion or to the existence of names of dead persons in the register. The register of voters is on INEC website, so concerned citizens can check out the register, and in event they find anyone whom they know and they have proof that the persons are no more, they can call the attention, apply to the Commission, make their objections known, and they will be taken through the protocol of the issue being addressed. And at the end of the day, before the 2023 general election, for instance, quite a number of, not significant number, but some names were delisted from the register, a little over 7,000. It dropped in the ocean, but it was something. Those were the names that were brought up. Again, that is tied to the issue of culture. Many people find it difficult to talk about death, to come up to say, oh, this person is dead, and so the person should be taken out of the register. Again, political consideration. Some of the political gladiators believe that the larger the number in the register, the better for them. I don't know how that works. And so they're just comfortable with having those names there. But the Commission is making effort. And again, like I said, the recommendations was that INEC suggested was that INEC would collaborate with NIMSI and with National Population Commission to see how those names can be identified and delisted from the register ahead of the next general elections.
It's good to know that INEC is doing something about this. What factor does trust or credibility of the electoral process play in influencing turnout?
Trust plays a very significant role in voter turnout, because naturally citizens will not participate in an activity that they do not have trust or belief in, where they do not think that their votes would count. So a lot lies on the shoulders of the Electoral Commission, which is INEC, to ensure that every vote counts. And that is why we need to ensure and assure, that is why we need to sustain assurance of voters and citizenry that their votes would count.
And that's a good place to leave it. I'm very happy to hear about early voting and that being considered. Thank you so much for making out the time to be with us. The Director of Voter Education, INEC, Mrs. Victoria Etta Messi. He who fails to plan, plans to fail. So the saying goes. So being an early bird to combat voter apathy may be a step in the right direction to uphold Nigeria's nascent democracy. For Special Report, I'm Olumide Macaulay. Thank you for watching.